So Hearthstone is a live service game which started in 2014. Broadly speaking, it's what we'd think of as a collectible card game, similar to something like Magic the Gathering or the original Pokemon trading card game with characters and other intellectual property from the Warcraft universe, which includes the MMO, World of Warcraft, probably the most popular one, and the strategy games Warcraft 1 to 3. Hearthstone is famous for being somewhat more chaotic and random than its non-digital predecessors. They lean a lot into utilising mechanics which you simply couldn't do with a physical deck of cards. So lots of things like cards causing random effects and making other cards appear that you don't even own and stuff like that. More recently, it's become what Blizzard would refer to as a platform game, not a platformer like Mario, but a service-based game which contains various different games within it, including auto battlers and other types of game modes. In this episode, we're looking at Hearthstone and discussing the kinds of things that linguists might have to say about it.
No.
Okie dokie.
Hi Joe,
Hi Ibi.
thanks for that intro.
I wrote it myself with my keyboard.
Wow, and your fingers.
And my fingers. What do you know about Hearthstone?
Very little, I have to say. I've never played it. I'm familiar with the whole World of Warcraft universe. I used to play World of Warcraft like a decade ago or so. So I'm familiar with the world and the kinds of characters and creatures in it.
So one thing you might not know is it's a shared world, but there's also a sort of framing device where, so the Hearthstone in World of Warcraft is like the magical device you get to go back to the tavern, right? It teleports you back to home. And in the framing device in the Hearthstone game, if you open it up, all the interface looks like this beautiful wooden box. And the idea is you're going into a tavern as a character from the Warcraft world and playing this game that exists within Warcraft. So it's similar to Gwent in The Witcher.
Yeah.
It's like a framing device
I
of it
get
being
it.
a game within a game. So
Yeah.
all of the sort of intellectual property that exists within Hearthstone is from Warcraft, but it's like a layer removed. So
Yeah.
you'll see characters and go, oh, I remember getting a quest from them in World of Warcraft or whatever. But occasionally the content is interpreted in a slightly different way. It's slightly goofier. I mean, Warcraft is goofy anyway. But if you imagine World of Warcraft is the Lord of the Rings, and this is the Terry Pratchett's Discworld, you know, it's a step goofier, or maybe several steps goofier, depending on
Yeah.
what voices you do when you read Lord of the Rings, you know. So what you have done a bit of a literature review for us this time, and you've gone and gathered lots of stuff to do with Hearthstone and language.
Yes.
What possessed you to do such a thing?
That's a very good question. I don't know. So I know you play Hearthstone a lot. And I thought it would be quite interesting to have a very broad look at possible intersections between linguistics and game studies and see what kind of questions a linguist might ask in relation to a specific game.
Interesting, yeah. So, I mean, I think a game like this is quite interesting from a linguistics point of view because every time you play a card, it has text on it, and if
Yes.
the text wasn't there, you wouldn't know how to play the game
Yeah.
at all, right?
So text is a key feature of the game, right? Because you have these playing cards and they have text on it, and you need to be able to read and understand that text in order to play the game, right? So language is a central feature of the game, but it's different to a game like, say, Heaven's Vault, which we've previously discussed on this podcast, right?
Which is like language puzzles, right?
Exactly, where language and translation is sort of the game mechanic. Here, language isn't really the game mechanic, it's just part of the medium of playing the game. And yeah, it tells you about the characters in the world, but it also tells you about what specific skills your characters have, your minions have,
Right.
and what they can do and what you can do with them.
Yeah, and I think typically in a video game, when we think of a video game, we think there's an environment, there's a little person that runs around in the environment, and we're often interacting through things like physics reactions, right?
Yeah.
And you don't need to sort of explicitly understand the rules of the game to play. You sort of experiment and you feel it out because it's a physical system. And in something like a board game or a card game, it is much more like the players need to understand every rule in order to actually operate the game. Obviously, a digital card game is slightly different, but we have these exposed rules that are written out in language for us. So,
And that's quite interesting, because if you think of a different kind of like board game like chess, right? Or Snakes and Ladders or whatever it might be, the way you learn that is you have a separate little booklet that tells you what the rules are, and you read the rules, and then hopefully you memorize them, and then you can play the game. Whereas with Hearthstone, right, every card has a bit of the rules on them, and you're constantly being faced with the rule as you're playing it. And I mean, eventually I assume you know what certain cards do without you having to read it every time. But then if you get a new card that you've never had before, you don't need to go to an external rule manual. You just look at the card and it tells you what you have to do and what it can do.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of show you some of the words on the cards before we get too deep into the literature. But before we go there, I thought it was, just to highlight, if this is the first episode of the podcast that a listener has listened to, and they're coming to this because maybe they're interested in Hearthstone or they're interested in that area of gaming, and they have a sort of tangential interest in linguistics but have never really looked into it, then I think this is going to be a bit of a sort of lay of the land of the different ways that linguistics interacts with game studies, right? Because we've got a paper we're looking at which is to do with sort of kind of big, it's kind of big data, isn't it? Quantitative.
I wouldn't call it big data, but it's a quantitative.
How many datas do you have to have for the data to be big?
At least 1,020,000.
1 million. So when I used to work in a sort of very commercial free-to-play game studio, our threshold for statistical significance for player data was 10,000.
Okay, I made that number up also. I don't actually know when just normal quants ends and big data starts.
So if you're looking at the YouTube version of this podcast and you know where the threshold is of how many data, how much data, how much data, if you're American, you have to have for it to become big. I'd love to know. But we've got one sort of paper we're looking at that's very quantitative. Yeah. That's like taking a large amount of data and classifying it. We've got another one that is to do with how people behave in the game, which is from a very qualitative, like, how do people interpret their own thing they're doing and stuff like that. It's like the two kind of academic research doesn't have to be divided into these two lines, but it often is because of methods and methodologies of like people that study big quantitative data where you can put things into numbers and categories, and qualitative data which is to do with experience and stuff like that. And then we've got a paper about localization, which is also qualitative. Which is qualitative as well, but it's looking specifically at what's happening in the game rather than what's happening with players, I guess.
And it's and we can talk about this a little bit later. So because we have a quants and a qualitative paper, both looking at the language of the game itself, and then the one that looks at player communication, and to see how they differ and what kind of insights they might give us.
So you're getting the sort of greatest hits of ways in which linguists might interact with a game, or the content of the game, or the culture around it.
There are different other ways in which linguists look at games, or in a broader sense that we've not covered today. So there is things to do with games and language learning. There is a lot of research on how players communicate while they're playing a game, and very often that's in relation to like voice chats and stuff like that, which doesn't have anything to do with the game itself, but more like the communication of players playing it. Or you have lots of work on discourses surrounding games as well. But the papers we're looking at today specifically are looking at parts of the game Hearthstone as an object, and the language in the game, and or linguistic affordances, communicative affordances of the game.
Which is lovely, because if you go back to game studies in sort of the early 2000s, there was a massive wave of game studies that was all to do with MMOs. It was all to do with EverQuest and World of Warcraft and that. And it was coming from a very sociological background, and it was always about players and their communication. I say always, that's probably an exaggeration, but there was a time when you could sort of ironically refer to game studies as World of Warcraft studies. And I think that some of that was a product of who were academics and what did they play. You know, if you go back to the, like I remember in the early 2000s, I had friends who played Warcraft. I couldn't play it because I didn't have a good enough computer and we didn't have a good enough internet connection. So that was very much a sort of, PC gaming was always already a sort of middle class, older demographic, but PC gaming that was online in like 2003, that kind of really limits who's playing it. So you get a bank of researchers who do play games, but they're specifically interested in this, and then you also get this kind of, I guess, sociological lean towards studying the players and their discourse rather than the game itself, because that's perhaps what they can sort of make their institution interested in, because it's not a formal study of the game, it's like, how can we study people in virtual spaces? And they're more interested in the game as a place where online conversation happens than like, oh, what do these quests mean, or that kind of stuff. So it's really interesting to look at this now and see that we are finally in a stage where you can look up a very popular game and find that there are all of these different angles on, you know, game plus language, Hearthstone plus language. We've got papers about localization. We've got papers looking at a big body of data from the game itself, and then, you know, papers that are more to do with behaviour and how people communicate and how they use the affordances of the game to communicate. So I'm really excited. It's, you know, it's not a full literature review. It's a scatter of things we found interesting to look at. But before we go into it, we're gonna have to deal with this idea of keywords in a moment.
Okay.
So if you haven't played Hearthstone but you've played a Magic the Gathering or a Pokemon or whatever, you will know of this idea of keywords where there is like a, you know, there's a whole concept that they shrink down into a single word. And for example, in Magic the Gathering, there is the keyword flying, and they put it in italics, so you know it's a keyword. And that means that this creature cannot be attacked by another creature unless that creature also has flying, right? And it's just sort of like avoids them and goes over them, that kind of thing.
So it's a quality of the creature, and then you have to know what it means.
Yeah, and
it doesn't, because it doesn't just mean this creature flies. It has more meaning than just that.
Yeah, and it's a way of condensing like a whole sentence that's repeated a lot into one word, so that you can save space on the card and people have less to read. So one of the papers we're going to look at is covering these. And what I wanted to do first, because I thought it would be a fun little game to see how some of these things are translated, I'm going to give you some of the Hearthstone keywords in their German version.
Okay.
Because that's your, you know, first language, and people also get to hear my terrible pronunciation, which would be very funny. And I want to see, like, without playing the game, whether the translation you come back to me with in English is actually what the English word is, or if it's like a slightly different adjacent word. Because I know there's been some controversy about things being mistranslated in this game, which we'll come to later. I think I've got something on that as well. So I've got 6 of these for you.
All right.
And the first one is Spott. What would you translate that directly to in English?
Mocking.
Mocking, interesting. I'll give you the English straight away. So in the game, this means taunt. Right?
Okay, yeah.
So can you think of what a taunt action would normally do in an RPG or something like that?
It will piss the other person off.
Yeah, it would like an attract and attack, right?
Okay.
So it's kind of
right.
It's like one of your creatures is blocking the other player from attacking anything but that creature, right? So that's interesting already because we've got mock instead of taunt, which is not quite quite exact. The next one is Kampfschrei.
Yeah, that's like battle cry.
Yep, that's exactly one-for-one battle cry. That's right. Todesruchen. Todesruchen.
Yeah, that's like death rattle. Yeah.
So what if you just by feel? What do you think a battle cry and a death rattle would be in this game?
I don't know. Some kind of action that triggers when your minion dies and then something happens.
Yeah, that's the death rattle, and the battle cry is like the inverse. It's when they come into the battlefield. Their first turn, they do this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you can see how they're related because they're both like the character makes a noise, like it's a cry or it's a rattle. So there's like something going on there to help you remember. And the next one is Gottes Shield. Mm-hmm. What would you translate that as?
Divine Shield?
It is Divine Shield, yeah. But it's Gottes, it's God's shield.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think. I don't think we have a real word for divine in German, because it's either holy something, which is holy and not divine, right? Or Gott and göttlich, which is probably what divine is in English.
Godly.
Göttlich, godly. Yeah.
So these sort of start to get you towards theme as well, because when Death Rattle was first introduced, it was part of a set where it's mostly applied to undead creatures, right? So any minion can have a Death Rattle, but they will introduce a rule in a way that sort of associates it with a particular type of thing.
Okay.
So the Divine Shield is like a bubble shield where the character can absorb any amount of damage, and they don't take that damage and the shield just goes away, right? So it gives them like an extra life. And that is generally associated with like the paladin and the priest and the holy classes.
Yeah, okay.
It can still be on other things. You can have an undead that has that as well, but generally they sort of give the classes their character by giving them these keywords and other class like things that we're not talking about at this stage. So, you know, Gottes Shield, it's like a glowy gold bubble over the character, and it pops and it protects them and stuff. Next one, Windzorn.
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 Yeah, that's wind. Wind is wind. Zorn is anger. So
an angry fart.
Maybe not.
it is wind fury. So this is when a creature can attack twice.
Okay.
So it's like a haste ability that allows it to move really fast, and it's more associated with the shaman. It's like a elemental kind of power thing. And then the last one I've got Wutanfall,
which is a hissy fit, which is a fit of anger, right?
Yeah, which is a really funny translation because it's actually rage, right? So or enrage. So this is it's a keyword that has a follow on. So if you have enrage, it'll be followed by a colon and then something else. So it might be like enrage, gain 2 attack, which means when this creature gets attacked and loses some health, it becomes enraged, it goes red, and then it gets this follow-on effect.
I'm sad that the actual English term isn't hissy fit. That would be very good.
Campaign to change. Blizzard, if you're listening, please change the English version of the enrage to hissy fit, even though that takes up a lot more space on the card. But you can start to see how, these keywords, they help you to have a rule that repeats again and again. Loads of creatures have a battle cry, loads of creatures have a death rattle, loads of creatures have divine shield. But there's also this layer of like thematics that help you to remember what it does, right? So the divine shield is like this holy yellow thing. It's more associated with the holy characters. There's this kind of it's kind of what we talked about when we did the episode about Ludimes, where we talked about like if a Ludime is a unit of play or a unit of rules, is a thematic element also a Ludime? Or do we need another word for that to kind of extend the linguistic metaphor that Raf Costa was using in that episode? And here you've got this kind of marriage of like, what does the thing do as a rule, and then what is it called, and then how is it portrayed as a little visual effect, on the screen? And does it look like a nice holy sparkly thing? Does it look like a fiery
how does it relate
thing?
to the world and the kinds of abilities the different kinds of creatures might have?
And some of these are standard fantasy things, like we get taunt effects, like the last Dragon Age game had taunt abilities where warriors could aggro everything around them, it would come and attack. It's the same concept. It works differently in terms of the rules, but people will be familiar with how it works. So I tortured you with my German pronunciations because we need to introduce the idea of keywords because they play quite a big role in the first paper. And that is, it's by Hakuin and Xanthos. It came out in 2021. And it was in the Digital Scholarship of the Humanities Journal, and this paper is called Evolution of Linguistic Complexity in Hearthstone. A resource and an example in linguistic game studies. So they're deliberately trying to bridge game studies and linguistics as fields, which makes perfect sense because game studies is basically often just anything that has games as its object, right? This is studying a particular corpus of early Hearthstone. Mm-hmm. So what a lot of these card games do is they have a rotating kind of schedule of content where every year some cards will become quote-unquote illegal and you can't play with them anymore, and they change the content round.
Yeah.
And this is partly done to make lots of money, and it's partly done just so that there is always like a puzzle of like working out how to play the game. That's part of why players of things like Hearthstone and Magic the Gathering put up with this.
Yeah.
Is because when the new content comes in, you then have this kind of metagaming thing of like theory crafting and working out how to put together these new toys, because all of the content doesn't go out of date at once. It's like you lose 25% of it and the new stuff comes in. And the time that they're looking at this, even though the paper came out in 2021, they're looking at the language on the cards from a specific date range.
Yeah, it's the early year and a half or so, I think.
And it's basically before Hearthstone brought in these rotations of content.
Yeah. So it was the first chunk of time in the game where they started with the sort of core cards, and then over a period of time, I think 5 or 6 different extra sets were introduced. So overall the number of cards was growing during that period, and then after that was the step where they started taking cards out again.
Yep.
So they stopped basically.
Yeah, and there were formats
point
here that they don't do it anymore as well, like these single-person adventures. I'm going to read out what the formats are, because I know that we've got people who would have clicked on this just because it's Hearthstone, and they'll go, oh yeah, the good old days. I remember those times. So we had the basic set, the classic set from 2014, and then the other 2 sets that came out in 2014 were Curse of Naxxramas, which was a single-player adventure, and that was actually the one that introduced the death rattle mechanic, because it's undead and spooky stuff. Goblins and Gnomes, and then in 2015 we've got Blackrock Mountain and the Grand Tournament. The Grand Tournament introduced a mechanic called Inspire, which was when you use your hero power, if a card has Inspire, then it triggers the Inspire keyword. So again, you can see how the thematic thing is happening there. Your hero is inspiring them by doing their hero thing. And then the last one in the group is League of Explorers. So they looked at 739 cards in total, and then built up these 2 banks of data where one of them were the card rule texts.
Yeah.
So the text you see on the cards as you play the game in order to play it. And the second body is the card flavour text, which you don't actually see as you're playing the game. You only see them in your collection. Yeah. And if you've played a physical version of one of these games, they tend to have both on the card. So when you look at a Pokemon card or a Magic the Gathering card, they put the flavour text and the rules together. And they often do a little stylistic thing, so you can see what the flavour text is and sort of ignore it while you're playing it.
Yeah.
They'll put it in tiny italic writing or something. But it was an interesting choice in the context of this study, because I would personally assume that most people never engage with the flavour text in Hearthstone at all, or it just sort of pops up accidentally when you're going through your collection to do something else, because it's just not very present as you're playing the game. But they put all of the text associated with the cards into these 2 banks of flavour text and rule text.
Yeah.
And
then they did some corpus linguistics magic, which we don't need to get into.
They did generate some tables though, or with some lines.
Tables with lines, yeah.
So the first trend that you would expect is that as more cards got added, there were also more total words. That's what the first table, figure 1, shows us.
Yeah.
So what are the actual findings here in this paper?
So what they did was, obviously they weren't looking at just a number of words. They were looking at types of words, right? Basically they were comparing the linguistic, they say complexity, but really what they mean is variety, comparing the rule text with the flavour text and seeing, are there more different kinds of words in one compared to the other? And perhaps unsurprising, yes. To read a little sentence from the conclusion: rule texts are thus consistently characterized by a much more controlled vocabulary than flavour texts. Being one of the core mechanics of the game, rules are phrased in a consistent way, repetitively, using a comparatively small set of lexical items, i.e. vocabulary.
Yeah, and I think this is the area where positioning this as a bridge between linguistics and game studies becomes difficult, because I can see how if you were a linguistics person who'd never really engaged with games on any level, you might read that and find it insightful in some way. But from a game studies point of view, it seems quite obvious when you pick apart the wording, because it's really not anything specific to do with games, and it's more to do with the distinction between like emotive descriptive text, which is what the flavour text is, and instructional text.
Yeah, it's basically comparing two text types that have two different functions, and determining that one has a wider range of words than the other, right? Yeah. Which is not surprising.
Yeah,
even for a linguist.
Yeah, exactly. If you were to look at a manual of like how to, well, I was going to say an IKEA furniture, but they don't have words in; they just have the little
like a cooking recipe, right?
Yeah, like a cooking recipe. Because it's an instructional text, it is not, for example, going to use different synonyms for the same word every time it mentions it. You know, whereas if you were to write a poem about the same thing, unless you were deliberately using repetition as like a formal device, most of the time in like more kind of flowery or artistic language, you are encouraged to use synonyms and not repeat the same word.
Yeah.
So it's like, these are just general rules of how different types of language work, or written language work in English, right? Maybe not universally, but definitely in English, that there is a rule of how you communicate when you're giving instructions, which is to use less linguistic variety, and when you are trying to make a exciting or kind of emotion-inducing description of something, then you use more variety, right?
Yeah.
So it feels unfortunate, because I think there was an opportunity to do something way more interesting with this set of data, and I don't really know exactly what that was, but it definitely wasn't this, right? Because I mean, there's some value to it, and if anything, even if it's just showing linguists, hey, you can do stuff with games because some games have a lot of words in them, right? But this whole what it shows us, or at least what the analysis of this shows us, is just, first, it's just what the intention of the author was, which, fair enough, you can like independently look at a text or an object, a media object, and say, oh yeah, they said they were going to do it this way, and they did, and we verified it with data. You can do that. But secondly, it's not really showing us anything that's specific about games or this game, because it's just these two types of language use that exist everywhere in our culture, everywhere in our media, and it's really, what it's really illustrating is that games, and particularly a game like Hearthstone, do have these two types of language use in them. And I guess there are media texts that only include one. They are just instructional, or they're just artistic. Yeah. And I think of you gave the example of a recipe, right? Yeah. So many times when we look at a recipe online, we have the recipe at the bottom, and then above that we have 12 pages to scroll through of like, when my grandmother first left Romania, she used to walk all day in the meadows and the pastures and collect little handfuls of soil, and you think, where's this going? And it goes off, and of course it's there to sell ads. But that's an example of like a jump between those two modes that lots of people find very funny, because you're just trying to get the recipe, and there's like this whole emotive story there to sort of to go through. Yeah.
As a linguist, I don't. This was, of the three we're going to discuss, for me the least interesting paper. First of all, because I'm not a quant person myself, and as you say, I mean, it's a valid finding, and you might have a hunch that, I would say rule text probably has a smaller variety of words than the flavour text as an intuitive thing, right? And it's nice to have a actual quantitative verification of that. But I agree that there is probably more interesting things that you can do with that kind of data. So what I was thinking, for instance, because they talk about, they mention keywords, right? But they don't really talk about keywords very much in terms of their data analysis. And what I was quite interested in, and again, actually, you don't need a quantitative approach for this. You would do this qualitatively. But looking at word formation in the case of keywords, how are they formed? Are there specific patterns that reoccur, and how opaque or not are they, for instance. So some of them, the examples you gave me, some of them I can sort of, Divine Shield, I can sort of guess what that is, but in other cases, the death rattle one, right? Or the battle cry. It's not immediately apparent that battle cry is something that triggers when the card first goes to the deck and things like that, So looking at those keywords and looking at word formation and how transparent or opaque rules are, and then also looking at maybe translations of those, how they differ in different languages might be something that might be more interesting to me personally.
And I think you could link some of this back to the sort of genealogical approach that we saw in the Raf Costa book a few episodes ago, the Ludimes, where you can trace like a linguistic term coming through games. So you might pick up a game that makes loads of assumptions about what words mean and not understand those things because it's sort of drawing on this big kind of bank of language that's come from other games. This seems like the sort of thing that this type of analysis could do. So if you think of like the rarity scale for loot in games, it like goes common, uncommon, rare, epic, legendary, or something else, right? But that's a thing where lots of people will intuitively understand that now because they've played other games with it. So I think you could do this kind of analysis, like jumping between games or like tracing like language coming from one game to another and stuff like that as well. But there was one other thing I wanted to raise with this paper before we moved on, and I don't think it's necessarily like I know it sounds like we're just ripping this to bits, but I think some of the stuff in it is just a tendency of a particular type of research or the way that people are encouraged to do research. And very early in the paper you get something that you get in all types of academic texts, whether it's a 3-page paper or like someone's thesis or whatever, you sort of have to justify why you're doing the research by saying nothing like this exists already. And there's like a categorization that starts at the beginning where the authors talk about the types of engagements you usually get between linguists and games. And they put them into these 3 categories. And the first one is like when games are used to teach language or to teach about language, like we talked about last month. This is like one of those categories. So it's kind of pedagogical focus. And then there is a category of kind of linguistics in games research, which is kind of like the MMO studies stuff I talked about earlier, which is like how do gamers communicate with each other, and how do people talk about games or around games, but not necessarily the talking that's happening in games with characters and stuff like that. And then the third category, they talk about language which isn't in the game itself, but it's paratext. So how games are spoken about in surrounding media and like games culture.
Just discourse.
Discourse. So, I mean, I've done stuff in that field of like how do games journalists talk about particular types of games and gamers and stuff. But they sort of, one of the issues I found with the way that this was worded is they sort of talk about it as if, people aren't studying games as an object and looking at specific games. And that's like because researchers haven't thought to do that, or they don't want to do that, right? And it's like my experience of trying to get support for research within a university was very much that a university has its kind of areas, its kind of research agendas that it wants you to fit your research into, and studying specific media texts often is very hard to justify. So if you do something that's like education focused or sociologically focused and you're like, how does this thing impact young people's lives or something like that? It's usually easier to get like a whatever 50, 60 something year old person is head of your research division to like sign off on that kind of thing. Because they can see the social value of it versus like, I'm going to do a deep dive into The Witcher and analyse how people use swearing in it.
And if we think about within the humanities, the sorts of cultural artifacts that people are studying in terms of which of those have more like social capital and therefore also actual monetary capital in terms of funding you get for them, right? Like literature studies is a established field, right? And then film studies had to really fight to become an established field, and the idea of studying films for the sake of studying films, right? And then game studies came after that, and is even a newer field, and the idea of studying a game now for the sake of studying a game is like probably strange to some people, and still strange, right? So it's part of this research culture of what's worthy of being studied in its own right, first of all, right? And then yeah, you need to justify it. You need to justify it within your own department probably, but you also need to justify it when you apply for funding, right? And then
Yeah.
that there are biases, and there are certain things that are considered more worthy and more prestigious than other things. So yeah.
Yeah, I know that's a massive aside, and it's not really a specific issue with this paper, but I do get frustrated when I see, you have this point in your paper where you need to justify why you did it, and you have to say there's a gap in the research, and sort of not addressing the reason for that gap. Like, probably one of the most prominent reasons for not studying games as objects or artifacts is just a lack of institutional support. It's not that people aren't interested in it, or that people are only interested in, games as learning devices or something like that. It's that the institutions that fund and support researchers are only interested in certain types of research. So, I could bang my drum about that all day, but it's not a problem that's specific to this paper. So, should we move on to the second one, the one where we talk about... So, I think this one is fascinating because it really helps us to understand the distinction between translation and localization. And I'm sure lots of people listening will understand that distinction because they play games and they're kind of familiar with what these things mean. But translation is, changing the words from one language to another, right?
Yep.
And localization is changing the words and also making the kind of end result sort of appropriate for the target culture.
Yeah.
And we've actually seen with Hearthstone, this is not from any of the papers, but last year in 2024, there's been a load of complaints about the translations from English to German in Hearthstone changing. So I found this forum post. We'll put a link to it with the show notes, like we will with the papers as well. But there are these kind of mechanical problems where they've got a keyword like corpse, for example, like a corpse that you might reanimate as a zombie, and they changed the keyword between Körper and Leiche.
Yeah.
And they just started inconsistently using these words. So it's led the sort of German, the people who are playing in German to believe that this is perhaps because there's some experimentation going on with AI translation. And yeah, basically because you've got keywords in the game and then you get a new card and it has been auto-translated, it's not taking into account the references to like keywords that already exist. It's really bad, right? Because it's not just a bad translation that doesn't make sense.
It breaks the game.
Breaks the game, or at least like the code is still the same, the game logic is still the same, but the player's ability to understand the cause and effect of their cards is going to be broken, right? So this is a great example of why you need humans to localize. Like, it's a negative example. It's an example of what goes wrong when you treat localization just as translation and you try and get a computer to do it. And I think the next paper we're going to look at just shows how much kind of nuanced thought goes into localizing something rather than translating it. And in the paper...
And translation on its own is already such a intricate, difficult task that requires you to, think little flavors of language, right? But then when you go into localization, it's even more.
Yes. So if you think like translating a sentence, even if you don't care about the surrounding context, you've probably still got to move some words around and everything to make it make grammatical sense. But then when you're localizing something, if there's humor, you then have to think about. Does this joke work for a Japanese audience or a French audience or whatever, and change it? And then in the example we're looking at, you've got the word for word meaning, the cultural element of humor, and then also still trying to make the game make sense at the same time. So it's such a complex job. And what we're actually looking at in this paper, this is by Wes Robertson. It was published in Perspective, Studies in Translation Theories and Practice. And this came out in 2018, and it is about the localization of Hearthstone into Japanese, but like it's not even like broadly about that. It's about how they handle humor, right? And this is like I only understand a small wedge of this paper, but it has given me an appreciation of how when you have a different writing system, how humor can work differently, right? Because we have. Just to give you the name of the paper as well, it's called Unspeakable Puns, kanji-dependent wordplay as a localization strategy in Japanese.
Yeah.
And we'll go through some of the examples in it, but it's really kind of taking a deep dive into how particular cards in Hearthstone have been translated for Japanese, and it's using that as a case study to explain how a joke might be formed in Japanese and how jokes in Japanese can take a completely different structure than we would understand them, because the way that the written language works enables types of pun that we can't even really imagine, because we don't have the so when we make a joke, the example they give is a fisherman's favourite guitar is the bass guitar, right? Because a bass and a bass doesn't sound the same, but when you read it, it's the same word. And that's like one of the ways that puns can work in English, is there's this similarity in this dimension. But the way that the written script in Japanese works, because in kanji you have, or in Japanese you have multiple types of script that you have to learn at the same time. So there are three forms of Japanese writing, and then the Roman alphabet as well. And you use them all. And it's like a combinatory language of using these different forms of expression. And when you choose to create a word, there are lots of different options of how you put that word together in terms of the ideograms that go into it.
So of the three Japanese writing systems, leaving out the Roman letters for now, two of them are phonographic, right? So they are basically what we have in our Roman alphabet as well, where a sign means a sound. And then there's a third one, which has sort of a double meaning, the kanji one, right? So a sign will represent a specific sounds, usually a syllabic sound. So you might have one that would be pronounced as toe. But then that sign doesn't just signify a sound, it also signifies an entire concept. So you have this double signification, and that's something that you can play with, apparently.
Yeah. And before we get into the specific examples, this paper is also a really good little historical snapshot of some of the jokes that are already in Hearthstone in English, because they kind of list some of them. Like you have like a pirate with lots of eyes, and when it attacks it says "I," you know, that kind of stuff. So there's all of this silly jokey humour in Hearthstone already.
And it's in English, right? It works through the written language, puns through sound similarity, right? In combination with the image that you have, right? So it's part of it is a visual gag, and then also the broader sort of world and your knowledge of the world. And then in Japanese you have this extra layer where you can make puns or sort of humorous references to things that in English you can't do, because we have letters that mean sounds only, but in kanji you have this double meaning that you can use to make sort of multi-layered meanings that then create jokes. And what I found very interesting reading this paper was, at a sort of broader level, what seems to be, according to the author, the approach to localizing the entire game, a sort of macro approach where the localizers don't necessarily are concerned with making sure that every pun or every pop cultural reference that you have in the original is translated or taken over into whatever the target language is. But it's more about creating an overall environment of humor and wordplay for the players to enjoy. So they actually said there is loads of examples where you might have a pun or some other kind of wordplay in the original English, and then we have cases where there is just nothing in the target.
In the translation, but it's about the overall experience.
But also reverse, there are cases where in the original English you might not have a specific pun in a word or in a sentence, but then the people who did the localization saw an opportunity to add one in in the target language, and that's quite interesting to
Yeah.
just to not really bother so much about making sure each instance is translated, but
Yeah.
to do an overall approach.
Yeah, there's not like a quota of 45% of the English cards had a joke in, so we will make 45% of the cards. It's more like the tone of this game is silly, irreverent, playful. Some of the jokes are sort of dad jokes. There's lots of little like weird winks to other things that are quite hidden. Now, there's a card they mentioned in this called Grizzled Guardian, and they haven't
Yeah.
actually mentioned the reference here, but it's the Gruffalo.
Yes,
So
but
one of my favourite Easter eggs is that one of the cards is just randomly the Gruffalo,
Yeah.
and you're not going to know what the Gruffalo is unless you've got kids
Yeah.
under a certain age, right? But yeah, but I mean, to come back to the kind of 2024 auto-translate mess, or suspected auto-translate mess, this is such a good example of, the kind of positive extreme of what is localization versus just translating the words of something, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just, oh, can we translate this, and when there's a joke, we try and make that joke funny in the other culture. It's like, no, we're looking at this whole experience as a thing and thinking about the tone and the mood of it and the type of emotional response someone's supposed to have to it, and then translating everything to try and produce that same effect. And as you say, it's like the language layer in this game of like what the cards are called and and it's not not just it's the visual language as well, what's depicted in the art.
Yeah.
All of this stuff is playful and it's meant to feel kind of goofy. And one of the reasons why I think Hearthstone works, for me personally as a player, is it has this big mix of registers in. So if you want to play a rogue or a warlock and be like a very edgy kind of in your head of like what you're role playing as with your deck of cards, you can. But then there are also cards and concepts that are very playful and silly. And if you look at some alternatives, like they made a very similar game for Elder Scrolls, like all of the stuff from Skyrim and Oblivion and stuff, and it was so sort of serious and grim, and everything was grey and brown, and it just didn't have this like range of registers that Hearthstone has. And so far we've talked about Hearthstone as being comedic, and it is, but it has these elements. It's still the world of Warcraft. It's still this big epic place where big battles happen and stuff.
Yeah.
But there is this sort of like playfulness that's all the way through it, and I think that what you talked about a moment ago about the approach of, it's not about when there's a joke we translate the joke. It's more, we've got a localization team that understand the general tone of the thing, and they're going to just do their best effort to make it feel the same way on the other end, rather than sticking it into auto translate and mangling it. I want to go through a couple of the examples.
Yeah. And just to say, if you are listening to this / watching this on YouTube, then you have an advantage because you're going to see some examples actually written out. Especially for this paper, that's recommended because it's quite difficult to explain how the kanji works without looking at it. Mm-hmm. But we're going to try our best.
Yeah, so you've got Finger the Flying Star, who is like a ninja Murloc. So Murlocs are little fish people. And he's like a fish-themed ninja. So he's got like a starfish on his head. He's throwing some starfish. He's got these swords that are swordfish. Mm-hmm. And they've completely changed the name. He's not called Finger anymore, because Finger is a portmanteau of fin and ninja, right? So they completely changed the name, and they change it to Hitode Ryu Ninja Rokumaru, which is, it's like a very specific... so the Hitode is a word for ninja, which is a novel compound meaning flying blade hand. But the phonetic values of the three characters that make up flying blade hand also signify the word starfish. Right? So you've got a totally different set of like meanings of what the individual bits are and what the joke is to what the English one is. But the end result is still this kind of funny amalgamation of like a fishy ninja, right? A fish themed ninja. But the way that the joke is working is just something that cannot work in English, because it's like, here are these three characters that go together to form Flying Blade Hand, which is a way of saying a ninja, and those three characters can also go together to form the compound starfish. And there's just no equivalent in our language, so you can sort of see how complex what's going on here is. And then there's a few examples that you can go through, but I liked the Fiery Bat one as well. I thought that was really interesting. So the card Fiery Bat has a burning bat on it. It's like, I think the trolls ride these in Warcraft, and the the card is called Enma Komori. I'm going to be butchering the pronunciation. But the Komori means bat. And the kanji compound Enma is a novel compound. It wouldn't appear in any dictionary is what they mean. Made up of flame and demon, Enma. However, the compound's phonetic value, Enma, so what it sounds like, signals the extant word for the Buddhist god of hell, right? So you're getting flame demon, which also means like devil, and you're just getting all of these layered meanings for like a fire bat that aren't even there in the original one. And I'm sure we'll have some listeners who have followed lots of like translation and localization projects and know of similar examples in like, you know, games coming from Japan to English and things being changed and stuff like this. But this is probably the first time I've really looked at anything like this in any depth, and it is really fascinating, particularly with a language that just works in a fundamentally different way, to see how this is done.
And just to compare this to the previous paper that we looked at, right? So both look at the language that's the words on the cards, but in very different ways, right? So we have a quantitative approach, and here we have a qualitative approach, and again, this is, you know, preference, but this paper is I think so much more interesting than the first one, and you know, just doing an actual deep, close look at the language and how it works and how this multi-layer of meaning is actually achieved, which is fascinating and complex enough in English, but then, you know, if you have a language with a writing system that gives you an extra layer, it's really fascinating.
I mean, it's definitely been interesting or helpful to look at both these papers together, because the first one sort of gave us that, again, maybe not super insightful, but that distinction between like how does the functional language of a game work versus how does the like kind of more expressive, playful side of the language work. And actually, they're talking about the names of cards here, which sort of sits in the middle. So when you're playing a game of Hearthstone, you don't see the flavour text, and that kind of sits in the middle of things, right? Because as you mentioned earlier, you would get to a point where you just see a card and you remember what it does, because you recognise the art and you recognise the name, and you've learnt what the rule is. So although the flavour text is hidden when you're playing the game, the title of the card isn't, and the title of the card
and the image isn't.
Yeah, and the image isn't, right? So those are elements that are flavour, right? So that you've got the rule text there, and then you have something like Fiery Bat or Finja, the Fish Ninja, or whatever his name was. The Flying Star. And that is flavour, right? And I think that this second paper, the one about the Japanese localization, is interesting because it is dealing with this layer of language that isn't functional language. It is playful flavour language, the names of things. I mean, it's functional to the degree that the name hints at the effect and then it becomes a mnemonic, right? So if you have a character that is called something berserker, it makes it easy to remember that it has an enrage effect, because we have this broad trope in fantasy RPGs fit, right? of barbarians and berserkers have the hissy fit power, right? So there's a dual function of the name and the image of being like the flavour and the mnemonic, which is like, again, I'm not saying anything remarkable. This is how games work, right? Even in chess, we've got the fiction layer that helps us remember that the bishop is more powerful than the pawn, right? But this paper is giving, you know, even if you take away the localization aspect of this player, just the insight into the playfulness of the language is interesting. And then to see that transposed into a language where the very idea of playfulness and punning is just structurally different is very, very interesting. So if you have access to that, I would have a look at that if it sounded interesting, because there are more of these specific examples. And they're just cool to nerd out on, I think, because there's multiple operations happening. Like in that Finja example, it's like the starfish thing and the changing of the name to something else. There's a lot of work going on, and when I think of how many cards that these people have localized, it boggles my mind a little bit.
Shall we move on to the third paper? Okay, so the final one, which is by Ajoranta and Siltonen. It's called Why Do Players Misuse Emotes in Hearthstone? Negotiating the Use of Communicative Affordances in Online Multiplayer Game.
Yeah.
It was published in 2018 in Game Studies.
Yep, gamestudies.org. And if you are not coming from an academic background, but you find the stuff we talk about on this podcast interesting, then I should plug gamestudies.org because it is open source.
Yeah.
And if you're like a game designer or just someone who's really into games and you want to see what the kind of academics are doing around it and you find the sort of stuff we talk about interesting, I would go and have a root around on gamestudies.org because it's open source and some of it you'll go, oh, that's a load of old nonsense, but some of it's very interesting.
Yeah.
And one of the things we need to sort of explain before we talk about this paper is what emotes are in the and they are a normal thing in lots of different types of games now, like Fortnite has them and stuff like this, but it's a way of allowing players to communicate in a very limited and strict way where you don't get on a voice chat and talk to people and you don't send text messages. You can send text messages in Hearthstone, but often not with the person you're playing with who's a random matchup, right?
Yeah.
So they have this system that allows you to use these different functions. That's on this screenshot, it's greetings, well played, like a compliment, thanks, sorry, oops, and threaten.
Yeah.
And the way it works is your hero is a representative of a class, like a warrior or a wizard or whatever. And then you have, different warriors and wizards that you collect and so on. And as well as having a portrait that represents the character you're playing, they have a voice pack. So the emote for threaten might be, I will crush you, if you're a warrior. And it might be something else as a rogue. It might be like, I will stab you in the back, in a rogue voice.
Yeah.
That's my rogue voice. I will stab you in the back. And this paper is all about what concepts of manners and how people use these.
Yeah, they use, yes.
It's not just about the emotes, is it? But the emotes form a big part.
Yeah,
of
so
that.
it's two-part. Part of it is the limits and affordances of the emote system, which are an in-game feature, right? It's the developers have come up with this. They've decided there are these 6 emotes that players can use, and these are the actual lines that the characters will say depending on what class they are, and so on. And then the second layer is looking at how players actually feel about the use of emotes, and specifically what kind of usage they get annoyed by or offended by. So the researchers have collected data from an online forum where people discuss emote usage, and you said manners earlier. So apparently the term that's used in those fora is bad manners.
Yeah.
That's like the term that the gamers themselves use. Which
Yeah,
is
and
why
that's not necessarily specific.
It's not
to
a
Hearthstone,
it's not a technical term that the researchers have come up with. It's just a term that is used in the
and
in
it's
this
just
community.
a concept of gaming etiquette, right?
Yes.
In video games we call it bad manners or BM, but it exists elsewhere, right? Like, coughing when someone's taking a shot in snooker would be against the etiquette of the game, right? If you did it deliberately, right?
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. But I think what's interesting here is like people's sense of what bad manners is very different.
Yeah.
And go on.
What's very interesting is that at the beginning of the paper, the authors talk about why we have this limited emote system in the first place. So apparently, the aim was that the developers wanted to limit the ways in which players can troll or offend or just upset other players, which is why they've limited it to 6 emotes. Yeah. And there's also apparently been some changes, that some emotes were removed and others have been put into the system. Let me see if I can find one that I found quite interesting.
It's while you're looking for that, it's also worth noting that this isn't like Blizzard's first rodeo in this area.
Yeah.
When they were making World of Warcraft, they had to do considerations around this stuff. And World of Warcraft is a very different type of game because you've got lots of people in the same area, whereas in Hearthstone it's one person versus another. But they've sort of already been through this process of like, how do we police communication? What do we censor? And they ended up going for like, you can only communicate with people who are on your team, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So apparently there used to be a sorry emote that was then removed at some point and replaced with a wow emote, which is an interesting choice
Uh-huh.
if you want to, if your aim is to limit negative communication, especially because one of the 6 options is threaten,
Yeah.
which,
Yeah.
and then the other thing which we might get to in a minute is whenever, even if you just have one emote, right, and whatever that is, even if it's just hello, there will always be ways in which any language can be used sarcastically.
Yeah.
So the idea that you can have emotes that will never be used in a way that can be taken as aggressive, mocking,
Yeah.
whatever it might be, right, that's from a linguistic perspective,
Yeah.
that's pure fantasy.
So just in case people have never played, just to give examples of how you can sort of use and abuse these. Someone on the other side of the table plays a move that you consider to be stupid or foolish.
Yeah.
And then you say thanks,
Yeah.
right? And that is kind of passive aggressive, I guess. It's kind of
Laughing at the other,
snarky.
yeah.
Yeah. And so there's an interesting thing going on in this paper where they're sort of taking the developers' stated reasons for things as if they are the reason, right? And even if we go way back, like one of the reasons for having this type of system is that you can play with a player who speaks a different language.
Yes.
And you click on threaten and your character says, I will crush you. But they are playing in German or Japanese or whatever, and it translates it,
Yeah.
right? So that's one of the reasons. I think another reason is that it kind of allows you to slightly roleplay your character because they have their own lines and stuff. And if you think of the tone of this this IP, if you want to call it that, it's this kind of like Saturday morning kids cartoon sort of silly fantasy thing, and having characters going ha 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 I will crush you all the time, or doing those more sneaky things like saying ha ha thanks when the other person messes up.
Yeah.
That's totally in line with the tone of the world, right?
Yeah.
So they kind of have said they don't want these negative interactions, but from my perspective, it feels more like it's trying to funnel toxicity into something that is softer. We can't get rid of this thing. As you say, you can always do it. And they say here, for example, there was lucky was one. You could say lucky, and it says that was removed from the game because it was used for evil more than good.
Yeah.
So there's these judgments going on about which of these are, when is one of these sort of sarcastic comments leaning over into just being purely toxic?
Yeah, and it's also, it's very interesting that the threaten one, also when we when they look at the actual things that people on the forum were complaining about, I don't think they mentioned the threaten one.
Well, that's because the threaten one has a pure usage, right? It just means what it means.
It seems to be the sarcasm that people really find.
Because that
offensive.
is emanating from the player because they chose the time to use that emote, which is what gives its meaning.
But it's also, if I threaten you, right, it's also the player choosing to do that.
Yeah,
it's
but
just
it's
in a more...
It's what you call an ortho game, right? 2 people playing against each other and one of them wins. So saying, I'm going to beat you at this game is like the most vanilla form of smack talk you can do. Because it's like, we're playing a game and that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
My favourite time to
But then you're not meant to rub it in and say thanks, right? That's the...
yeah, exactly. Because all of the other ones, when you use them in a sarcastic context, that feels very deliberate, right? And it feels... there's a similar effect if you play tabletop games where you fight another character, where you roll dice. That creates like a level of removal where it doesn't feel malicious. And then if you have a game that uses like a poker mechanic where you have a handful of cards and you fight each other by revealing a handful of cards, there are a lot of games, these kind of tabletop games with miniatures on a map where you fight that way. And it feels so much more deliberate and like a brutal confrontation between 2 people because you don't have the randomness in the middle. And there's a similar thing going on here where the snarky comments feel cutting because it's like the timing of them is the player exercising their wit against the other player.
Yeah.
And I can think of like some silly examples, like the threaten example. I always really like using that just as the other player is killing me. I find it really funny because it makes me feel like... like when the bad guy falls in the lava at the end of like a kids show and they go, I'll get you, you'll pay for this. I really like doing that because it just feels really goofy.
Yeah, but it's, that's self-deprecating, right? Whereas a lot of the things that the people in the forum seem to be complaining about is the impression that they're being mocked.
Yes. And all of this is an example of pragmatic meanings, right?
Yes.
You've got. I just wanted to point out for people listening that Ibi has left a comment on the document that says, "Man, I love pragmatic meanings," which just made me chuckle.
Yeah.
Because pragmatics is a whole branch of linguistics,
Yes,
right?
it's basically to do with studying language in use and meanings that are more than just the word meaning, right? And the meaning of words and utterances in context, right? So the difference between thanks means I express gratitude, right? Like the semantic meaning is what you get in the dictionary if you look it up, right? Thanks means I appreciate what you did for me, right?
Yeah.
Or
so saying thanks in the context of an ortho game is insulting the other person by saying you just made a bad move. Right?
Thanks can also mean haha, you're an idiot.
Yeah. And you can also use wow in the same way. In
exactly.
This game. The wow effect is similar. And the sorry is like an inverted version because you do a powerful move against the other player, you block their big thing, you cast a big spell that wipes their board, and then you say sorry to them. And it's like, well, that's not an earnest expression of being sorry, is it? It's rubbing it in kind of thing.
Yeah, and also there's one that's well played, right? Which you can also use sort of mockingly if someone plays a really bad or stupid move, and you can just go well played. Yeah,
but you often just use it to actually, express that you are wowed by what the other person did. You do. Yeah, it gets used perfectly earnestly like that. One of the examples of the other kind of stuff that could be considered bad manners in this is basically anything that wastes the other player's time. And this isn't unique to Hearthstone. There is a culture in a lot of these games, like the tabletop ones, if you go to a Magic the Gathering tournament, of like, when is it correct to concede? And I suppose some version of this exists in chess as well, right?
Yeah.
Where if you're really losing, depending on the kind of play culture you come from, you are expected to concede at some point, and if you do not concede when everyone looking can see that you're losing the game, you are perceived as being like rude to the other player and wasting their time.
Yeah.
And this is like, I guess it's more gestural than previously we've been talking about the emotes, which they're not really emotes because the character says a line, right? It's more of a verbal thing. But these things are more gestural. So they talk about roping, which is when you sort of go over your time, you get like a little burning fuse show up to tick down the last 10 seconds of your round.
Yeah.
And they refer to this as roping when you deliberately use up all your time because you're trying to waste the other person's time. And these are things that you could have very different perceptions of. I have the example that I mentioned to you previously was I had a game once where myself and the other player were both playing as healers, as priests, who have a healing ability, and you can target anything on the battlefield with the healing ability. And we traded like 4 or 5 rounds of just healing each other and not doing anything else. And
which is not the aim of the game,
it's
right?
not the aim of the game, right? You're not supposed... I mean, there might be some situation where you can heal the other player's stuff to give yourself an advantage. I'm not sure what that would be, but it is hypothetically possible. But we were like refusing to play the game by just healing each other. And it was a very, very funny moment because I don't know this person. I can't communicate with them outside of the emote system. And we're just healing each other and saying thanks. And... there are contexts where if someone does that and you're playing a game against them, it will come across as rude because your expectation as a player is this person is here to provide me a challenge.
Yeah.
Right? So if you are deliberately failing at a game, then it becomes like unenjoyable. But there was just this particular game where it lined up that these two people with a silly sense of humour decided to heal each other and say thanks for like 10 minutes. And I think that's beautiful. I think that's great that can happen. But a lot of the times, these kind of, wasting someone's time not playing the game properly are the kind of other category of BM, right?
Yeah.
They're like, you're taking too long for your turn, or you're deliberately doing something annoying in the game. So
what I also found interesting about this paper and the author's discussion of the data that they were looking at. So politeness, impoliteness, and interpersonal conflicts is one of my main research areas. So I was particularly interested in this paper. And the data just goes to show that what is considered rude or bad manners or offensive is purely, in a lot of ways, in the eye of the beholder. Because they gave a list of things that people commonly complained about on this forum, right? And one of them is conceding at the end of a match and not letting your opponent kill you when you've played badly.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next one is not conceding when it's clear that you have lost, forcing the other player to kill you.
So it's like assumption about values, right? Like
Yeah.
some people value their time more, and some people value getting that lovely crunchy feel of like taking the last bit of health off someone. Yeah.
So it's very interesting. And then also what they talk about a lot here is that because of the limited communicative means that you have, and not knowing anything about the other player. And this is always true, right? We cannot access another person's intentions ever, right? Even if we have a face-to-face conversation. But in this case, it's even there is no feedback loop that tells you whether how you interpret another person's communication was intended that way or not, because you don't have that direct back and forth. Right?
And even in the real world, the situations where we do have that feedback loop are only in like very close relationships or in work relationships where there is some mechanism to encourage you to discuss these things, right?
Yeah.
The vast majority of interactions we have with people, we are guessing these kinds of things.
Yeah, but even in face-to-face interaction, like you say something and I say, oh...
Did you mean...
I react in a way that lets you know I didn't like that, right? It's like, oh, that's a bit rude, right? And then you can say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. I that's not how I intended it. I'm sorry, I offended you, or whatever it might be, right? But here, like, someone does a sarcastic sorry, the other person gets offended and maybe does a wow or whatever, right? That first person might have no idea of figuring out that I'm pissed off and I'm doing that to, like, get back at them or whatever, right? So it's
and you can't even say sorry because we've already established that the sorry button is sarcastic.
Yeah. So. Yes. So it creates very interesting situations, and it seems that a lot of the examples they found in the forum is people talking about with very like sure statements about what they know the other person intended, which I find very funny as a linguist, working a lot with interactional data and just knowing that people, you don't know what another person intends, and there's always, even in face-to-face interactions, there's always leeway as to meaning. And it's something that's negotiated, and here there is so much in the data about, oh, I hate it when people use it and in order to do this, and it's like, how do you know that that's what they intend?
Yeah, and I think the example of like not conceding or conceding at the wrong time is a great one, because it gives you this glimpse into just how different people's motivations can be. Like, I want the satisfaction of taking that last bit of health off, versus I want to get my 30 seconds back and not have that extra bit of gameplay.
Or someone literally, you might lose internet connection, right, which looks like someone's conceding, or you might just have to go and do something else and need to close the game, right? So there is all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with trying to avoid being killed.
So it's like we're dealing with the fact that the affordances of Hearthstone create this sort of black box where you aren't able to explain yourself and you aren't able to have the social cues to understand why another person is doing something. So I think these are things that happen a lot in games in general. So if you play a tabletop role-playing game like Dungeons & Dragons, like most people who've DM'd or played lots of D&D know that people come to the table with very different expectations of what something like Dungeons & Dragons is, right? So you get these different player motivations and types, and there are mechanisms like, you know, session 0, like the conversation you have before you start a campaign. There are these kind of mechanisms you can put in place to make sure that everyone's values of what they're playing and why they're playing it, and even what the game is, align, right? Because you can take or leave different rules and house rule them and stuff like this. And the examples they're giving from this, it's like a forum analysis of how people talk about it in a forum. It's a discourse analysis of forums. Is like pointing towards what happens when you don't give people these like negotiation mechanisms, right? And I think like you can also look at this genre generally of collectible card games. Wizards of the Coast with Magic the Gathering, they came up with these different psychographic profiles for player motivations, and they called them Johnny, Timmy, and Spike. And they there are like fem equivalents now. Yeah, a Timmy or a Tammy is about using big creatures and big spells, and exciting play motivates them, right? They don't care about winning consistently. Their idea is like, my deck of cards, if I play it exactly right, it will pay off in this big sparkly thing, right? But they don't care about winning consistently. And then you've got a Spike that is about winning as much as possible, like a tournament player.
Yeah.
And then the what's Fem Spike? Spike is gender neutral term. So they're both called Spike. And then a Johnny and a Jenny is about complex and creative decks and doesn't really care about winning at all. It's just like, how can I put these mechanics together in a weird way so that they, and like knowing that, sort of gives you a sense of, you have two people sitting down at a table and they are basically playing a different game from each other in their head.
Yeah.
And if you think of like chess as a game chess doesn't have any asymmetry in its game, right? The only difference between the players is who goes first might slightly impact certain things about the game. Now the players can have a different style of playing chess, right? Of how aggressive they are, how much they think things through versus go off gut feel, how much they try and do strange things to throw off the other player. And all of these things like play into how a chess player has a style.
Yeah.
But in something like Magic the Gathering or Hearthstone, you've got that layered in with the difference in each other's decks, and then the different style is like, how do you construct your deck, and then how do you pilot it as you play, and all of these things amount to the stuff we're seeing with the kind of bad manners discussion with Hearthstone, where it's like one person wants the game to finish properly because they want their payoff of their thing at the end, and another player wants a completely different. The other player wants to play 10 games in a row so they can climb the ladder in the tournament. Right. So this is why you've got a couple of reasons why you get these. It's not just bad manners is happening, right? It's what the paper shows us, if anything, is that the community cannot consistently agree on what constitutes bad manners, and that is because it is a game that has this lack of affordances for communicating as you're playing, and also it is the type of game that attracts these wildly different types of motivations for playing in the first place.
People
right?
want have different expectations of what they want in a player experience, right?
And the more diverse a game is in the first place, the more likely you are to get these kind of conflicts, right? If you're doing a raid in World of Warcraft, you might not want to chat, right? You might want to be the sort of player who's just like, keep the chat free for important stuff like people asking for healing and stuff. Don't talk about random stuff while we're doing this, right? So the concept of manners is like that you can't. It's harder to agree on a set idea of what's good manners because the motivations for playing the game in the first place, or what people want to be happening moment to moment as they play, is just totally different from each other.
The sort of last comment I have is, I was wondering, what we don't know is the demographic of the people who post on the forum and how representative that is of the overall, the average player who plays Hearthstone. You know, who are those people who play Hearthstone and then get so annoyed by an emote that they go on the internet and post on a forum, right?
Yeah. So there's a selection bias in terms of who's there in the first place. And there might be a bunch of people posting those complaints who are on there every day talking about Hearthstone, but it's like, you don't have an insight into the kind of run up to making a post in the first place, right? Of like, what kind of leads someone to do that. I
think that's all on those 3 papers.
And I think it's really interesting to look at them all together, to like have a game as a thing to look at, and then to look at these different approaches to it and what they're concerned with. Because if you go back to the paper, the one that was about the kind of difference between the flavour text and the rules text, it was kind of felt like it was an interesting method, but it could have been kind of directed at something more fruitful, right? Yeah,
the research question wasn't that interesting for me, I think.
It's like, how different are these two things? It's like, well, we kind of already know how they're different because of culture in general and the intentions of the designers and all these other things. So you're just going to kind of confirm or deny that thing, but probably not find out anything new. This is the kind of research question of like, you know, what is bad manners in this game? What do people consider bad manners in this game? Where, like, as you say, the methodology of just kind of going on a forum and reading what's there is going to produce certain types of biases. And if you wanted to do this more sort of like designed experiment sort of positivist type thing that they were doing in the first paper, it would be interesting to see how you would apply that type of methodology to this sort of research question, right? Of like, I don't know, like, what experience, you could maybe do this with game tracking data, right? And I'm sure they do it at Blizzard. When people stop playing Hearthstone, right? When they churn, we call it in the biz. It's like your last session, right? And then you never play again. You're considered a churned player because you haven't played in 30 days. What was the experience of that player in that match, that last match they had? Because you could take the data from all of these churn players, their last match, and you could count the emote uses. And you could say, when people said sorry lots of times, that led to the most churn.
But you don't know if that's the reason, right?
No, of course you don't. But you're dealing with like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of sessions in this case, so you can start to build up a sense of. And I'm not saying this to be like, oh, qualitative research isn't important, quantitative is better. But I think the kind of quantitative lens of using big data sets could be pointed at more interesting or fruitful questions if it was taking this more like embedded in the community approach as its starting point. So yeah. That is everything we have to say about Hearthstone for now. I've got a list of things to tell people to do. I think people should follow the Say It Like You Play It YouTube channel, whether they are listening to this on YouTube or elsewhere. Obviously, if you're listening to us on a podcasting platform and you haven't subscribed to it, please do that. That would be nice.
Yeah, please subscribe. Please like. Please review. Leave us 5 stars. Do all the things that you can do.
All of the things, yeah. Was that bad manners? What we just did?
No.
I feel like this is the normal time when people ask for things.
Yeah.
We also have a coffee account.
We have a Buy Me a Coffee.
Buy Me a Coffee, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
And that will go towards buying us new chairs so that you won't hear my chair squeak as much when we record.
I would very much appreciate a donation towards that.
Ibi currently is the editor for this podcast, which means that when I do this in my chair, Ibi doesn't like it.
No, and this is hopefully also going to be the only squeak you're going to hear, because all of the other ones I will have edited out.
That one would have been left in for effect. So yeah, if you're watching the YouTube version of this, please do leave a comment because it helps with the engagement stats and showing this to more people who might like it. If you're on Apple or Spotify, leave a review. And if this is your first time listening to the podcast and you are interested in this sort of intersection of games and thinking about games and game design and thinking about language and linguistics and kind of culture generally, then go and have a look at some of our other episodes, whatever platform you're listening on. If you like fantasy and that's why you like Hearthstone, our very first episode was about D&D and the languages in D&D and how language works in D&D.
Yeah.
We've talked about Heaven's Vault and when games use language as puzzles. And yeah, really in this podcast what we're doing is exploring that kind of space to do with language in games.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have a very academic episode like this where we're more focused on what are researchers in the field doing. Sometimes we just look at a game ourselves and see what we think of it as a linguist and a game designer with a cultural studies background.
Yeah.
And
if there's any topic or any game that you think would work well as an episode you're interested in and would like us to discuss, then you can always send us recommendations and we might have a look at that.
Yeah, just not Scrabble.
Yeah.
We have a no Scrabble rule.
See, I haven't even considered Scrabble.
Maybe there are some studies on how Scrabble works in different languages and the balancing of it based on like what letters.
So
they need
there's
to
a trivia fact that I know about Scrabble, which I don't know if it's actually true or if it's one of those myths that float around the internet, but apparently there's this guy who won the French language Scrabble championship by learning the French dictionary by heart and not speaking any French.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like doing card counting, but the linguistic equivalent of...
Yeah.
I mean, imagine that designing Scrabble or localizing it and balancing it for different languages is very similar to the process of designing keyboards for different languages, of like letter
yeah,
frequencies
that's
and
true.
stuff like that. But
That is
if you are a Scrabble localizer, please reach out. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
I feel like, to be fair, if there are Scrabble localizers, I feel like they would be
Yeah.
the ideal audience for
See,
this
I'm
show.
I'm now wondering whether Scrabble exists in languages that use different scripts. I mean, I guess if you have like the Greek script, for instance, that would work. But anything that's not a phonemic script, whether that would work as Scrabble, I wonder.
Yeah, because you might try and say something like flying blade hand, and
how
someone thinks you're saying starfish.
how does Japanese Scrabble work? Is that a thing? That's what I want to
I
know
don't
now.
know. Japanese Scrabble's a pretty good band name, though.
Yeah, it is.
And with that bombshell, thank you for listening. See you next time.
Bye bye.
No.
Okie dokie.
Let's stand out by the coop.